This is the continuation of the lecture on legend symbology, labeling, and layouts. This portion will focus on the layouts. So as you know from the lecture notes, a layout is what you need to create in order to print out your map. So far we've been using maps that just stay online, but occasionally if you need to print it on paper, then you need to think about composing what is going to be on the sheet of paper itself. So that's what we're going to work on today. We have to switch our view in order to get from the data view, which is what we're looking at now and have been so far, to the layout view. You can do that a couple of ways. From the view pull down at the top, from data view to layout view. There's also a shortcut, a very teeny tiny little box at the bottom here that will switch you over to the layout view. Note that you're defaulted in a portrait format, a portrait orientation, which is vertical up and down. Since our map is of the United States in this case, which is wider than it is tall, in those cases you might want to switch your orientation to landscape, which is the other direction. So the first thing we want to do is switch that. So under your File pull down, we do this through the Page and Print Setup window. We switch the orientation here from portrait to landscape. Just as a note, you might want to make sure that your Use Printer Paper Settings box is checked, just if you need to print it out on your printer. Note that the map is still in portrait form, even though the page has shifted to landscape form. So we'll make adjustments to that a little bit later on. So we can see that our map now doesn't quite fit. In order to make an adjustment to it, it has to be selected. So the way to do that is to just click it, and it will give you these grabber bars, which we can then pull down and fit so that it now fits into the page that we have as the shaped page that we have. The first thing that we always want to do when we start making a map is to add what's referred to as a neatline. The Neatline identifies for us where, if you will, the edge of the paper is. So everything that we're going to add comes from our Insert pull down. So we'll start with a Neatline, which is just one of the items on the list. Once you open the box, you're going to select Place Inside Margins. That will determine where the edge of the page is, and therefore you know how much room you have to work with. You can change what the border looks like. I might make it a little bit thicker. Can add a background or a drop shadow if you like, but for the moment we'll just leave it as is. So now we have an image of what our page is supposed to look like. One thing that we need to recognize is the difference in the boxes that we have. You can see that I have highlighted the Neatline box, and it has the grabber bars. We want to be careful not to move that, because then we won't have the accurate page outline. We can also select the image, the grab boxes for the map itself. We have to understand the difference between what the amount of space the map will take up on the page versus what is inside that amount of space on the map. So for example, if I make the amount of space that the map will take up on the page this large, I can still change what is inside that space the same way that I would anything else. So now we can rearrange it to just show Missouri or show some other place, but yet it would only take up this amount of space on the map. If I wanted my map to be a more prominent presence on the image, I could enlarge the amount of space that the map is going to take up, but still zoom in just on the state of Missouri. So now I would have a larger state of Missouri. So just recognize there are two things to consider: what's inside your map box versus how big that map box is on the page itself. So we'll just keep those ideas in mind. The next thing that we're going to identify or add on here is a title. So the title is fairly easy, as are many of these steps. We just insert a title. Now what you'll get is a box that asks you for what you want your title to be. You want to be as clear as possible. Don't make people guess what your map is. So I'm going to call this Cities of the United States, and then we OK that. Now initially what we get is just a small little box that's presented on the map. If we want to change the font or the size of it, we have to get into its properties. Once it is selected, and note I just selected something else, so I have to make sure that my title box is selected. I can right click on it down to properties, or I can just double click on it. Then I can change my symbol, and I can either choose one of the pre-selected options here, or I can make my own choice over here. It doesn't, for this process, it doesn't really matter, but we'll just pick something. We'll make it a different size so that we'll be able to see it on our map. You can underline, right, all the things you can normally do, and then we'll just OK that process. So there's our cities. The next thing that we're going to add is the legend. Now, when we do the legend, we have to think about what's in our table of contents and what we want to show on the map. Whatever is drawn, remember that means there's a checkbox here, will automatically default into the legend. So since I'm showing cities of the United States, I might want to have cities and states because the states will give me some reference, but I might not necessarily need the lakes. Now maybe I use the lakes because they're pretty and they make the map a little more appealing, and that's fine, but whatever you're going to show on your map has to be listed in your table of contents, in your legend. So we'll go ahead and leave all of them checked for the moment. And then we'll insert the legend. And this is just a fairly simple process. Whatever is checked, whatever is drawn in your table of contents will appear on the left side. If you decide you don't want something, you can highlight it and take it back over to the other side by arrowing it back. But we've decided that we want all three, so we'll leave it. You can change the order that they're in, right? You could put lakes first or lakes last, whatever you choose to do, alphabetical, your choice. Here's a critical thing that we might want to think about. If you change your mind later, you sometimes have to redo the legend altogether. In this case, we only have 3 things that are going to be in our legend, so it won't be such a big deal. But let's say that you're listing all 50 states in your legend. If you only have 1 column, that's a very long column. So maybe you want to have 5 columns of 10 or 10 columns of 5, whichever. So you want to think about how many items, 1, 2, 3, doesn't matter. But if you have 50, you might want to change the number of columns in your legend. Once you've made those determinations, then you move on to the next field. If you want to change the legend, the name of it, usually legend or key, it's up to you, something like that. You can do some different things. I regularly suggest that you put a border around it just because it will separate it from the rest of the items on your map, although we will learn how to put a neat line around things as well. You can change what the lines look like. For example, in our case, lakes is a polygon, but maybe instead of showing it as just a square here, maybe we want to change the shape that it looks like on the legend to look like a body of water. So we could alter it that way. If we wanted to do states, we would highlight states here and make an additional change. We don't need to worry about this, and then we can just finish it. So what we end up with now is our legend. I just highlighted it, clicked, and dragged it out of the way. You can enlarge it, take up more space on the map, on the page, or less space on the page. I'm just going to get the items that we need here first, and then we'll start manipulating things around. The next thing that we're going to add is a north arrow. All of your maps for this class will need a north arrow. It's a very simple step, so there's no reason to leave it off. We just do the insert and then go down to north arrow. You select whichever north arrow suits your fancy and you OK it. Again, same idea. You can click and drag it. You can make it large. A few things about composition, which we will talk about, is the map is always the most important component of your layout. The north arrow is necessary, but not that prominent. It should not be that prominent. I'm just enlarging it so we can see it at the moment. The next thing that we'll add is the scale bar. Again, very important. We will learn how to do more than one map after a moment. So we need to recognize that if you have 2 maps on your layout, they each need to have their own scale bar, because each will be different. If one is a zoomed in area and one is a full extent, they would need to have separate and connected scale bars. So in this case, we'll go ahead and choose a scale bar, whichever one you like, whichever one suits you. You can identify the properties of it, which would separate whether you're going to have the units be in miles or kilometers. Sometimes you might need it to be different. We'll go ahead and stick with miles, and then we will OK that. So now I'm going to move my map out of the way here for a second and move my scale bar that corresponds to it right under it so that I remember which is which. My map doesn't really look like anything right now, so I'm going to go ahead and select it and then zoom out a little bit so that I can see a little bit better of what this was supposed to be. So you'll note that as I zoom out, the scale bar changes. Right? So right now it's this amount of space is 520 miles. If I zoom in 400, 300, right, they're connected. So if we have another map that's in here, it needs to have its own scale bar that is connected to it. So we'll work on that when that time comes. The next thing that we're going to need to have on here is what I refer to as an information box. I have listed in your notes all of the things that you need to include in terms of information on your layout. Now to do this, it's just a simple text box. So we'll just add a text box here. It opens up a teeny tiny, it's unfortunate that it works this way, but initially it just provides you with a text box that you then need to get into. So it usually occurs right in the center of the map. You just double click on it. Oops, sorry, right click. Double click on it, and then you can type whatever information you need. So in this case, you need to have your name. You need to have the assignment, whatever the assignment number is, the class. You also need to have the data source. So for us, we will just provide the ESRI data. You also need to have the date it was created. So the month, date, and year, right? Whatever the month, date, and year is. You can change the text of it if you want. You can we will put a box around it in a minute, those sorts of things. So initially we'll just OK it and see what it looks like. In order to move it, again, you have to select it. If you want this to be larger, you have to get into the properties of it and change the font size. So if you want the writing to be larger, you have to actually get into the properties box to make it larger. Now you can just leave that as is. You can see it just as a sort of freestanding text here, or you can put a dialog box around it. So what I'm going to do is highlight it, just select it so that the computer knows I want to work on that, and I'm going to insert a Neatline. And in this case, instead of placing around inside margins the way I did for my original Neatline, I'm going to place around selected elements. Now in this case, I'm just going to add a very small line. It doesn't need to be big, it just needs to separate it. I don't need a background for it, and I don't want a drop shadow. So I'm just going to leave a very simple line around it just so it separates it from the rest of the map. So that's our most basic information. At this point, we might want to try to design the page just a little bit better. This one doesn't look all that pretty. You'll note that if I go to move my text box, they are separated. The text is separated from the Neatline. So if I want them to move together, I have to tell the computer to do that. The way we do that is to select one, hold the control button down, and then select the other one. If you make a mistake, you have to start over. And then once you've selected them both, then they will move as a unit. We'll choose our scale bar here and move that down. We'll choose our map here and move that down. So then we can just begin to design the page in a way that makes the most sense. Again, your north arrow is necessary, but it is not the most critical portion of your map. Your legend is necessary, but it does not need to be the most critical portion. You could also put it inside your map like that. So again, then we would just manipulate the map until it looks the way that we would like for it to look. This is not necessarily the most beautiful map, but you get the idea. So that concludes this portion of the lecture.